So, hello everybody. I am what's left of Franck Bedrossian. Hope it will be enough. Anyway, thank you for not letting me alone here. I would like to first announce a little bit what shall be the plan of this conference, even though I imagine it to be quite fluent and flexible and interactive a little bit. And I will explain you why. So about the, let's say, virtual plan, because you know, us composers, we always make plans. Sometimes they fall through, sometimes not. So I will try to keep the line, but it's a very open plan. So I would like first to make a few, to do a few precisions about how I imagine it. First of all, I will be loyal to my title, to the title of the conference. And I will explain why I chose this title, because I think it raises a lot of questions, especially in the context now of this academy and so on. So once I will, first I will speak about the ideas that are coming to me at the moment about, as I told in the title, new textures, noise, complex sounds, and how we deal with it, and especially why we deal with it. Once I've done that, I think I will give a few examples especially focused on an orchestra piece that I composed in 2012. A piece without electronics, but where I had to face the reality, let's say, of the orchestra at the time, but trying to be very, to be very loyal to the material that I was using since several years, almost more than a decade actually. And I will speak about the constraints that we composers might face about that. After that, after a few elements of analysis, and I will show a few manuscripts about the method I'm using in order to work. After that, I would like to have, I will tell you when, kind of exchange with you, kind of conversation. And there are a few mics that are open somewhere. But in case you feel the need not to forget a question that you might have, feel free to interrupt me, because you see, it's always better to jump on a question rather than forgetting it. And in the end, after our conversation, kind of first conversation about what I will tell you, we will have a very special guest, composer Carmine Emanuele, who will speak about orchestration assisted, which is not my specialty. I mean, it's really his work. But I thought it would be very interesting to have him discussing the way that the computer can help, or let's say, propose solutions for us, knowing that it's quite a recent attempt compared to the attempt that happened with the pitches at IRCAM. Orchestration is a fairly recent territory of experimentation with computers. So I thought that we would have a kind of cross discussion with him, and of course with you all. So so one thing I would like to start with is, for once, the title. I said I was asked first to propose a conference about my music. Of course, I will speak mainly of my music, but in order to illustrate something which is hopefully interesting for everybody here. Which means finally the renewal of the vocabulary and the timbre of the orchestra, and what is at stake behind that. Because as you noticed during the presentation of the festival and the Academy, especially a few days ago, we spoke, well, no, I did not speak because I spoke about other things, about the contents of my presentation, but some subjects were, let's say, raised. And finally, it was about stereotypes, let's say, in new music. Fortunately or unfortunately, I think the debate is not closed. It's true that communitarian mimetism, which is called fashion, in other terms, does exist in any field, I think, especially artistic field. But if fashion does exist, it's maybe because it has a reason for existing. So I would say that the debate is not closed about the uselessness or not of fashion. It's a little bit subversive, I guess, because when I was much younger, I would say, oh, fashion is a terrible thing. And that's true, I'm still annoyed by this mimetism, if you want. Because I don't think that something new can possibly obtain the approval of a mass of people. It's something which is still to be discussed with you. I mean, but I'm sure you have each of you have your idea about that. So, first of all, let's start with the title. In search of new textures. So the first thing is why in search? That's not very difficult. We are at IRCAM. So that's for sure one part which is not difficult to understand. I think the spirit of research is something important for all of us. I might have my take on that, because why always looking for something new? I've been asked those kind of things in the past. Not maybe here that much, but in the past I've been asked those kind of things. I think it has to do with desire. It's very banal. When you're not looking for something new, very quickly you lose the desire. And if you lose the desire, you can be sure that people will hear it, because the audience is very clever for those kind of things, I guess. So, because we're looking for new desire, we're looking for new things. Why new textures? That's trickier. I guess that I would compare, and some people who had a class with me yesterday heard it already, but I guess that the renewal of timbre, not only with orchestra, but in general, and the enormous amount of interest for new techniques, new instrumental techniques, is quite profound, actually. It's not superficial. It could become superficial, and I will try to say when, but it's not a unique phenomenon. It's not only for extended techniques. At one point, it was more for spectra, for instance. Everybody would put a spectrum in his piece or in her piece. So now a lot of people are interested in using extended techniques. So why new textures? I think the situation, is comparable to, let's say, what happened in the beginning of the 20th century with the necessity of the harmonic renewal. Why? Because at that point, after Wagner, lots of composers were in search of an identity after such a very strong proposal, an influential composer. So it's true that, of course, as you know, some composers went to looked in the direction of modality, of folk music, of jazz, of many musical expressions that would allow them to renew the harmonic colors and possibly the hierarchies. Some people distorting the tonal system, some others overwhelming it, some others trying to find a substitute to the tonal system. But in between, since that moment, things have changed, and timbre has now a structural role in composition. Before, it was a little bit the package, let's say, the beautiful package for beautiful harmonic and melodic ideas. But now that the timbre has such a strong importance, I think that during the last decades, the renewal of timbre also gained its essential function. In other terms, I think that the renewal of harmony in the beginning of 20th century, the renewal of timbre at the end of the 20th century or beginning of 21st, is in a way comparable. It's something that we could, at least sociologically, there is something which has to do. If the timbre is very important, then it's normal that at one point we need to renew it. So once again, renewal not only for desire, but also in search of new identities, new emotions, because I don't think that you can separate the material from the aesthetics. And that's why I chose this first part for the title. Then I spoke about complex sounds and noises. I try to be more, let's say, federating, because some of you who might know my work, they heard about the idea of saturation, of articulation of excess, and all those kind of things, which creates a special context for noise and complex sounds. But I try to be quite inclusive, if you want, because not everybody has the same obsessions, of course, that I do. So, now that I spoke about the necessity of renewal of timbre, I would like also, because we're at IRCAM, but not only, to emphasize on one thing that maybe is a bit underrated, at least in my opinion. Of course, amongst you, most of the people already work with mixed pieces or only electroacoustic music and so on. And it's true that at one point for instrumental composers, let's say people coming only from the instrumental world or the vocal world, the electronics might have been a kind of additional device which would extend the possibilities in terms of speed, in terms of many things. If you are listening to the very first, or if you read the first essays about what the electronics can bring to us, it's quite naive and surprising, actually. But, I mean, there is nothing wrong with naiveness, I mean, in any case. And so, I would like to give, say, kind of my feedback about this. I guess that the influence of electronics has been, in a way, underrated at the beginning, which is quite normal, in the sense that one could have thought that the electronic would become a way of extending the instrumental world, but I think it went much further. It completely changed the listening. And this is why, I guess, also, we have to face the fact that if the listening has been modified, then the flesh of sound and the flesh of listening, in a way, has been altered also, has been modified too. And I guess this is my feeling about it, if you want, in the sense that when I started to write with only acoustic instruments, because I never did one piece only with tape and loudspeakers, it never happened. I always felt the need to have musicians on stage. And for dramatic reasons, sometimes traumatic, but mainly dramatic in the sense that the physicality and let's say the energetic presence of a musician is extremely important for me. And so I did not want to abandon that at all, never. But I've always thought that as the electronics was developing, the importance of complex sounds, of course, and the virtuosity, I would say, if we can call that the virtuosity of machines with complex sounds, for producing complex sounds, of course, but also for rhythmic and dynamic reasons. Everybody who has a little experience with electroacoustic music knows that you can have in your mind and in your memories so many articulations that are virtuosic or very fast articulations with complex sounds that are dreaming, that are staying in your memory, while you cannot necessarily reproduce them with the limits of the acoustic world. So it's a question of culture. We have that in mind, if you want. So if it's the culture, then why should we ignore it? And can we abandon our culture when it comes to orchestra or when it comes to opera? My response, for me at least, is no. I cannot abandon. So if I cannot abandon it, well, I have to find some ways of being creative with all the constraints which are coming out from a kind of translation, let's say, from the electronic world or influence of the electronic world into the instrumental world. And how this influence could possibly, in the best case, become seminal. By seminal, I mean, of course, how to give a function to what did not have any function before. And then we go back to the question of stereotypes. For me, a stereotype in any field, not only in music, comes out when there is a poor connection between the material itself and its necessary function in the musical discourse. If there is no function or a poor function, at the best it will be a decorative feature. At the worst, it will destroy the sense of the music. So, and I think that I was quite conscious of that when I started to work with extended techniques. I will say a few things about my experience, of course, but this is very important, and in the meantime, very obvious. I'm not the first one, and we are not the first ones to work with extended techniques, because, of course, personally, I was, let's say, listening religiously to some spectral music for breakfast, essentially. Sometimes later in the day, and also some Lachenmann, slightly less. Slightly less. No, I'm kidding, but not completely, in the sense that Lachenmann for breakfast. What a great title. I would like to emphasize on that. I think that my generation, at least in France, has been much more influenced by the spectralists and this idea of articulating something which is based on sound without necessary political aspects behind. And that's, or the faith that sound can be political without any additional purpose, if you want. But of course, the work of Lachenmann is very influential, and it has been a liberation it sounded like a liberation for many, many composers. Also in France. Why? Because I think a lot of people, not my generation, but the generation before, I think people understood that it was possible to create and write timbre without necessarily going in through the spectral attitude. And that was not that obvious at the time, I guess. So, once again, feel free of asking me questions or precisions about what I'm saying. Okay? Shyness is nice, but you know the song. So, of course, at one point, I will have you listening to the piece I will speak about for giving my examples. But I would like to, let's say, to announce a little bit the things that I'm going to talk about. Once again, a little bit freely, because I'm not sure to respect the order of the ideas. I will speak a little bit about the sociologic constraints and historical constraints of the orchestra, which oscillate in a way between fantasy and reality, because sometimes there are real constraints, lack of time for rehearsals, even some contracts, aspects which prevent maybe the composer to be totally in touch with the musicians permanently, like in chamber music, of course. So you have real constraints, and you have, let's say, unconscious and supplemental constraints that the composer invents for himself. Which has a name, it's called a taboo. Draw parallels, if you will. So I will speak about those kind of, I want to speak with you about those kind of things. And after that, quite quickly, I will go inside, let's say, the music, speak a little bit about the score and how I tried to resolve some issues when it comes to renew, let's say, the timbre of the orchestra for me when I was solicited for, when I was commissioned a piece. And then I will speak about the methods that I used, and possibly speak about the aesthetic goal of all of that. Of course, it's only mine, and I'm sure that in the best case, and I'm quite confident that many of you who are still interested in using the aesthetic techniques without a stereotyped function will possibly interact with me about it. So once again, yes, I think we should not confuse material, any material, that can become stereotyped if the function is not inventive, of course, or is not assigned to something. Okay, what we call a cliché says it all. A cliché is, say, a picture which was taken in a certain context with still in the picture, you're doing that every day, a certain amount of relationship between, let's say, the main subject and what is around. Okay, if you take it, this network of relationship, if you take it and you put it in your music, of course, there is a strong dissonance, let's say, between one network which does not integrate the other at all. Or sometimes, if your network, the musical discourse that you invented is not strong enough to afford a material which is already connotated, then it destroys, let's say, the style, possibly. After all, we could also speak about the necessity or not of a style. I would say that as a priori, for me, it's something important. So, maybe you have questions from now on before listening a little bit of music. It's a piece of 18 minutes, so if you want to take to make kind of discussion now, it's your chance. I mean, I don't know. I said a lot of things. Tell me it was a little bit interesting and ask questions, possibly. And don't be shy, once again. Everybody has seen the movie once? Okay, so I can go on with the music? Okay. At least, I would like everybody to feel free to ask if something was unclear. Not necessarily that you disagree, because you might not disagree, but if you have a doubt about something, please ask. So, I must say something before you listen to this piece. Some of you might know it. It's a piece which was commissioned. You're a special guest. You can applaud him if you want. Huh? Carmine. So, this piece was commissioned to me by the Donaueschingen Festival. It was in 2012. And I remember very well that I'm telling you about it because I think it's quite interesting in the process of composition. I was first asked to compose a piece with electronics, orchestra and electronics, with the SVR Freiburg studio, and you know. And I hesitated, but not for very long time, because it was the first time that I would write an official orchestra piece. Actually, my first orchestra piece was a piece for 35 musicians that I did at the Conservatoire in France, and well, it was a special project, if you want, very with a lot of economy of means and without electronics once again. But it's true that it was only 35 musicians, and it was at the Conservatoire, so the constraints were not sociologically were not exactly the same. But so I decided to do it without electronics because I wanted to find the same, let's say, the same quality of the musical discourse that I found in the chamber music and the ensemble. I did not want the orchestra to be inferior in terms of invention, let's say. At least the things that I felt, and I felt the need to write, I wanted the orchestra not to prevent me of doing so. So that's why I decided not for electronics mainly at the time. Later, 4 years later, I think, I accepted a commission with, from the same festival with electronics. But first, I wanted to have my kind of vis-a-vis, kind of duel with the orchestra, only with the, let's say, organic tools, if I may. But there was something like that in my mind. So I was very lucky, to be honest, for several reasons. First, because it was the SVR Freiburg and Baden-Baden orchestra, which at the time and still is a very flexible orchestra and motivated orchestra for new music. That's something to be said. I mean, probably at the time, the best orchestra for new music. And the conductor also was very supportive, François-Xavier Roth, who is conducting in the recording. So I was very lucky. And I knew that I would have also enough rehearsals. It has to be said, because it's not always the case, even though I don't think that in other circumstances I would have weakened my ambition necessarily. So maybe let's listen to it. And after that, it's called Itself, by the way. Well, why is this title? Actually, I remember that I knew that in the Donaueschingen, I would be asked a lot of explanations about my goals, my ambition, my historical position, and all those kind of things. And I thought that I would call it as it is, only for the music, if you want, because I don't think, even though it's not a very dramatic statement, because I'm not the only one to think so, I guess. But that music not being a deficient artistic expression, it has its own contents, and that's why it stands all alone. If it did not have its own contents, then it would be weak. But it's not the case, fortunately. So, let's go ahead with this piece. And after that, I will maybe raise a few questions and propose some. What were my solutions? So yes, it's 18 minutes. So let's see how you feel in 18 minutes. Sorry. As you maybe have noticed, there was a little issue and it came back at the beginning and I don't know why. So I did not write this da capo. I did not. Sorry. Sorry for that. I don't know what happened. I think I took the right. So I'm gonna go back to the middle. Wait a second. Should be fine. It's going to be longer than expected. So, yeah. I don't know if whilst listening to the piece or just now, you have. I know I'm not very successful with my request for questions, but if you have some questions now, feel free to ask, because maybe I did not speak about all the constraints and all the what was at stake. Yes, please.
I was just curious to know how much of rehearsal did you have, because you mentioned it was a special amount of time.
Yes, well, your question is exactly what I was going to speak about. Not exactly this, but about the sociologic constraints of the orchestra. I remember, I think that we had 2 sessions of partial rehearsals, plus, if I remember well, I'm not sure, but plus 3 rehearsals and the dress rehearsals. That's what we had. So let's say 4 rehearsals and yes, and which is a lot. So that's why I was saying that I was lucky. But I think also that the conductor and his special talent and capacity of organization and his knowledge, let's say, not only of this music, but of the repertoire also, really helped. And so I don't know if I responded to your questions. It's fine, yeah. One thing, so I don't know if there is another question. Apparently not. But I would like to speak about those social, let's say, constraints that are one of the reasons why the taboos are still remaining, if you want, sometimes for composers. One thing that I was told, and that really marked me, I mean, by one of the musicians, I don't remember exactly who it was, I think it was a percussion player. I told him that I was very happy with what they did, I mean, and which was true. And he said that to me that it was not that easy for them, and I was really surprised because they did very well in the ending. You know, I mean, compared to the score and what happened, and not only because of the amount of rehearsals, but they were doubting of one thing, and I found it very interesting. They said to me, or he said to me, was, you know, the noise, we know how to do it with the orchestra, because they played, he didn't tell me, but they played Lachemann and many people. I said, not only Lachemann, but some followers and so on. So for us, it's not that difficult. We know how to do pitch, too, because they played the repertoire and so on. But they told me the 2 mixed with rhythm, not easy. That's why he told me, and I was happy with that, because honest, I thought that it would not be necessarily a difficult piece for them if they had enough time, if you want. But they told me that yes, if you want, I was requiring a special kind of virtuosity, while I think it's quite simple, and I will speak about that later, so I'm anticipating a little bit, is that you have a kind of what I could call rhythmic resistance of complex sounds. That it's not that easy to phrase them, to articulate them with rhythm, and to be ambitious rhythmically. Lots of people, and I think I felt that very strongly, even though I did not formulate it at the time, but I was very frustrated with people using complex sounds in the field of new music, because generally I found the music to be slow, very slow, and it's a special pacing, you know what I mean? You like it or not, but I felt it was a kind of fatality of new music with complex sounds to be slow. And it was frustrating for me. And it's true that virtuosically, rhythmically, I did not want to abandon anything. So it's true that from that point of view, I'm quite ambitious, and that's what he was telling me, that finally I was remaining ambitious rhythmically, whilst I was supposed to be less, maybe. So I think that's why my music is virtuosic, really. Generally, it requires from the musician to be quite strong rhythmically and not to let down anything. Because if you're not articulating the whole thing, it becomes a permanent burst of energy, and that's not what I want. We want intelligence and brutality at the same time, maybe. So it has to be articulated. That's the thing. And that's what he told me. That it was difficult to articulate both. But finally, they did very well, and I think it's quite spectacular, the result. The fluentness to which they they managed to, that they reached finally. I was very happy with that. That was for one part of the sociological, let's say, constraints. Another one I knew that would happen was the hierarchy between musicians and groups. The social rigidity of an orchestra is obvious, if you want. You see that in terms of brightness, for instance, for the strings, you have at one point in my piece even, you have some moments of the strings alone, with mutes, with a mix of mute and divisions and everything, but still, the first violins are brighter. That's for sure. Even though they're supposed to be completely fused with the rest, so that's why I use some mute, etc. But then they start to have, let's say, the beginning of a melody or the beginning of a scale, they become brighter if they are first violins. Same thing they say for trumpets. They have the soul of individualistic characters. You know what I mean? Like in opera with individualistic characters and not, secondary ones. The oboe also is very on the fore, the trumpet, and you have a kind of unconscious brightness for some of them. Not only due to acoustic, but in terms of role in the repertoire. So what happens is that even though you want to fuse very much all the elements that you have, your music, which is fusing, if you want to, with complex sounds, it tends to fuse anyway. I will speak about that later. But your music will be analyzed by the unconscious history of the orchestra. Even though you want to fuse, you will be analyzed. That's what I mean. You have a synthetic goal, but the history will fragment the fusion because of the history of the orchestra and its unconscious, let's say, collective memory. Is that clear? I mean, I think it's something that we all experiment, even in chamber music, but in terms of role, and in fact, that with the orchestra, it's even bigger. So I think that's one of the reasons why I took a special, let's say, path with this piece that I conceived as a kind of haunted house, actually, which means that I felt that the weight of history would be always present with open windows, sometimes kind of choral appearing, like in a haunted house, really, and all of a sudden you close the window for going back to texture. And all the memories are threatened of disappearance by the texture, which is a kind of hostile magma, if you want. So each character of the past which appears is threatened of death and threatened of disappearance and to become a texture once again. Okay, that's the let's say the dialectic movement within the piece. I think it's quite clear that each individual or group reminiscence of the past. There is no quote actually. It's all, let's say, it's really my music. I did not take any quote from the repertoire or any composer that I like. But I wanted to have this back and forth all the time. Formally, it was a little bit. It was one of the goals of the piece. So using the sociological weight and influence of the orchestra in order to make a form with it. It's true. And of course, it's a position which has been adopted by other composers, but not in the same way. I mean, when Rahman does Tan Suite mit Deutschland Lied, for instance, there is a relationship to the past which is obvious, and it's a part of the piece. But I think what is at stake is not the same culture, is not the same distortion too. So here, well, I spoke about those sociological constraints. I will not speak that much about what is supposed to be frustrating with the number of rehearsals, with all those kind of things. I guess that actually some things, as I said, are real in terms of constraints of time, essentially. Also the fact that when you are writing complex sounds with the orchestra, you might face one problem, is that people are not necessarily confident in what they are playing. And they don't know if it's right or if it's wrong, if you want. So generally, they need more than just a good performance note. So for this reason, I knew that the contact with musicians would be less, let's say, constant and less rich, more fragmented than with chamber music. So one thing that I did is that I consciously decided to give to some of the musicians things that would require time to be elaborated, especially to percussion players, harp and piano. Those ones I knew that I would have contact with them. Because they are not living themselves necessarily as a group. You know what I mean? So it's easier to have a direct contact with them. And for the other families of instruments, generally, I would take only things that would not require a lot of questions individually, but where the mixture would make sense very quickly, or at the best, yes. And that's one of the main tools I think I can expose, if you want, and explain. Not only because I know the piece, but also because I observed a lot the scores of young composers, especially now at the moment with the Academy, with a beautiful concert to come. Just a little bit of advertising, not for me. So it's on Saturday. Don't forget it. So this is something which is very important. Is that for me there is a selection about the extended techniques. I'm rejecting lots of them. Actually, lots of them. Why? Not only with the orchestra. Well, maybe with the orchestra slightly more than with chamber music and so on, but for aesthetic reasons, actually, or for compositional reasons, which is, why am I rejecting most of them, actually? Because when you're working with a musician, as you know, lots of things are appearing, or things that you did not know about, you know, some sounds that are able to obtain. The two reasons why I'm not using some of the techniques. One is the theatrical connotation and the fact that some of the sounds, in order to be obtained, need a certain kind of gestural extraversion, let's say, which is for me a problem because I don't want the theatrical aspect to be too prominent in my music. That's something. Or if there is a theater, a drama, it comes from the sound and the physicality, but it should not be played. I don't know. You know? And the second reason is that some of the sounds cannot be really developed in time. And my music is about the development of those textures. So if I'm finding one technique which is appealing because it creates a sound which is appealing, because a technique is never appealing in itself, then I might like it, but still abandoning it, which is paradoxical. Sometimes it's heartbreaking, frankly. Right? You know, you have one sound, say, okay, I like you very much, but I'm leaving. So this is a drama. But you have to sacrifice some things that you like for the general coherency of the compositional project. That's cruel, but it's exactly like in life. Sometimes you like very much some moments, some people, and you know that you need to go away in order to build something coherent, your trajectory. So, it's heartbreaking. Now that we came to this revelation, I would like to emphasize on, let's say, the role of complex sounds, let's say, in my music. After that, we could possibly have a discussion, even though I don't know. There are many composers here that I don't know, probably. But we could discuss that individually with some of you, if you want. But of course, the use of complex sounds, when it comes, of techniques is very different because we invent different functions for them. The first thing to do is to know why, to focus on the why, if you want, of a thing. Because when there is no clear response to the why, I think a musical element who has lost or never found its function, once again, is very visible, too visible. Sometimes it almost has a kind of touristic quality to it. So if you think that you're going to be discrete with a complex sound without function, you're really making a fool of yourself. I think so. And we're all in the same boat from that point of view. So that's important. Sometimes you have to quit sound that you like very much in order to avoid them to become too lonely. I mean, in the sense that you need to integrate them in a musical discourse. Otherwise, you might want to build something else. But it's not composition. For me, it's sound design. Not the same. So we could speak about that because it's a very burning subject, I think. But let's see how I wanted to integrate something, the complex sounds, and quite quickly what was and what is the role still of those complex sounds in my music. So I've been asked recently in a masterclass to explain, let's say in a few words, or I needed to explain in a few words how my music works, if you want, which is not an easy thing, by the way, not only for me, but for everybody. And it's true that what I wanted to propose is relies on the idea that I'm not proposing a musical discourse which is relying only on pitches, on harmony, on melody, principally, but where let's say, the hierarchy between musical dimensions, to avoid the P word, parameter word, would be rebalanced in the sense that the timbre takes over in terms of function very often, and the rhythm and the timbre might be more important, or the dynamics even, more important than the harmony and the pitches. But in my case, at least, it doesn't mean that I'm abandoning this aspect. Why? Because I've never been tempted by music which would only rely on timbre. Maybe there is one piece of mine that I composed in 2001, which was going more in that direction, where there is a kind of project of neutralization of the harmonic field. But it's a piece that I still like, but it's an extreme point, I think, in that direction. And did not do it again later that much, because for me it's more interesting to have a music which can be heard with different layers, where you can hear the evolution of timbre, you can hear the evolution of harmony if it's necessary. As you heard in the piece, there are moments that are almost purely harmonic. And I like this back and forth, and I will speak about this because this is the way I chose in order to create contrasts and a musical drama. So it's true that I'm trying to build an architecture, a sonic architecture, which becomes a drama in time, and which could be heard as a kind of permanent melody of timbre, but which is always, let's say, threatened or colored or articulated by many other things than timbre. Harmonies, sometimes melodies, it happens, and of course dynamic and rhythms. So at the end you don't know who is threatening who. If it's the timbre which is threatened by the rhythm, by the dynamics, or the harmony which is destroyed by the complex textures and so on, and who is becoming who. It's a lot of, let's say, drama around search of identities, about the destruction of them, about the isolation of one type of energy and another. I will speak about that. So now let's have a look maybe to the, not to the score itself, but to some excerpts of the manuscript. Before maybe some of you have questions or not on what I said. You're so respectful. It's beautiful.
Okay, I do have questions, but maybe we can do that.
Yes, but well, maybe after that we're supposed to speak about. It depends on what subject it is.
At any things that you say, I want to ask something. Then I'm just waiting.
Well,
okay?
if you if you start, you should finish. No.
Because I think it would be interesting to discuss, but I don't want to interrupt you too much. So maybe we do this at the end.
Okay, if you want, no problem. So it was an aborted question. It happens. So let's see maybe one thing which is a method of work for me, not necessarily for you, but at least I think it makes sense in regard of what I just said. Because when you decide that your musical discourse will be, let's say, always flexible in terms of hierarchy between some parameters, then one must have a coherent method of work in order to facilitate, to make it easier, if you want, this flexibility between parameters. So I wanted to, it's very rare that I have, not that I want to have, but that I have some manuscripts. It happened for this piece for one reason, that it was quite a radical way of working for me. Why? Because I decided for the first time, and it's something to say, that I was educated in a very harmonic way in France, the beautiful country of harmony, and with great predecessors from that point of view. And yes, that's true. And as time goes by, I mean, I remember, for instance, when I entered the conservatoire, nothing private here, I decided to write a piece for guitar at the time. And I was so obsessed with harmony that I was totally blocked, well, especially with the guitar. I don't know if you try to write a piece for guitar already, but it's quite difficult sometimes, especially harmonically, it's quite constraining. But anyway, I tried to do it. I was totally blocked, of course. At the moment I encountered Griset, it was even worse, because he had, not because of his, but because he was quite very different from this approach. If you want, he went very, very far in the direction of working with sound mainly, and rather than pitches or harmony. So for me, it was a kind of shock, of course. But so for me, it's something to start a piece without thinking too much about the harmony first, if you want. So that's what I've done for this piece. And sometimes I'll tell this story that in retrospect I found funny, but at the moment it was not that funny, is that I was asked by the artistic director if the piece was going well, you know what I mean? If I was not late, going well, it means are you late or not? And as a honest composer, I said it goes well. And it was not completely wrong. Why? Because I had composed quite a lot of the piece for me, but without no pitches, which means that at the time I was asked to score, I would have been slightly embarrassed, you know. And here what I had for let's say after 6 months of work, only dynamics, rhythms, metrics, whatever, you know, even the tempo, but not the pitches actually. I had quite a precise idea about the kind of complex sounds that I wanted, yeah, by souffle seul, which means breath tones and things like that. So that was the very first time when I decided to update, let's say, my way of working, and to give the priority to morphologies and, let's say, textures. in order not to be influenced at all by an harmonic constraint, which would prevent me of using some complex sounds. Because the problem, let's say, or one of the problems that you have when I spoke about rhythmic resistance, there is also an harmonic resistance of the complex sound. So there is a choice to make. Or you decide that, like I think the spectralists around 85, after Désintégration by Murray, I think they went back to a more harmonic project, letting go the complex sound in its, let's say, physicality. Or you decide to go back to order, and that, okay, you will deal with complex sounds when you can. And the other way around, which I think before my generation, at least in France, I don't think it was done that often. I mean, which say, okay, harmony is very important, or at least for me it was important. It will remain something important, but it's not superior. And that's for a French, it's something important, you know, and to decide this kind of thing. For me, it was a kind of subversive gesture. Not that I was feeling that I was revolutionary for that. No guillotine involved that time. But I was really, it took me several years actually to accept just to not put the pitches first. The very positive aspect of this method of work is that all parameters are equal on the paper, and that you will not have the complex sounds appearing when you can, when the harmony, the prison of harmony, is allowing you to go out a little bit. You know what I mean? But on the opposite, I would orchestrate all the textures that I decided, and I describe them most of the time in terms of, in terms of register, of course, in terms of thickness, in terms of grain, in terms of speed, because I notated a lot the rhythms, or the allure of sound, you know what I mean, in terms of, it seems, let's say here it seems a little bit simple because it's only trill, but it was trill combined with breath tone, or combined with vibrato plus trill, and all those kind of things, and superposition of speed for the same musician, and those kind of things. So a degree of activity which is quite high, what we could call virtuosic, but still feasible, doable for most of the musicians, if you want. So what I tried to elaborate was this melody of timbre, which has several dimensions inside all the time. So what are the different, let's say, tools that I used conceptually, let's say, even though it's a big word? It's true that I have always in mind some things that would prevent me of being blurred or chaotic. Why? Because when you're working with complex sounds at a very, let's say, with very much, a lot of density, I would say, for acoustic reasons, the complex sounds, they tend to fuse a lot, to create one layer all the time. And it's true that if you're using them all the time without any care for the register or their behavior, you end up with a music which has a lot of activity permanently, and where the melody of register is very blurred. For me, one model has always been Ligeti from that point of view. The form is really linked to his science, let's say, of using registers a lot. And very well articulated, of course, in terms of proportions, for sure, he's very strong for that, but also in terms of color. So, why did I show this? It was a way of showing that finally I was trying to revert the proposal in terms of method of work. Whilst I'm coming from a world where you think the harmony first, and then, I wouldn't say we'll see, but well, the rest would be a package, nice package, possibly. I try to have, for me it was a courage, let's say, it wouldn't be for maybe other composers from other countries, but for me it was kind of a revolution to accept the idea that the complex sounds will be able to appear at any point in the piece because they are not inferior conceptually. They are not considered politically, I would say, politically inferior to harmony. In my musical world, if you want, and not only in mine, because I think other composers are working in that direction now, it's a kind of political gesture to decide that one, let's say, or let's say you're a movie director and you decide that this actor, which you find bright and with a great potential, as we say in the US, great potential for this actor, you know, so you will decide that he will have the leading part. Well, it was not the case so far. So sometimes it requires a certain kind of audacious, let's say, movement to decide that one person, man or woman, will be the leading part of the scenario, if you want. And that's what I felt in terms of focus. And my feeling is that, once again, it's not a kind of absolutely, it's not subversive gesture, it's just the idea that you're changing. It's a change of focus, and you decide that one thing which was in the shadow will be in the light, if you want. For me, it was the case, due to my education, too, of course. So, I don't know if you have questions with this method of work at this point, or not. Yes, please. What's your name? Sorry. Okay, maybe we could give him a special mic, a complex mic. You start.
Thank you. So, at what stage of the composition do you feel the pitches in?
Ah, that's a very interesting question. After my conversation with the artistic director. No, it's not true. Not true. It's wrong. No. Well, maybe it's time to put the pitches. No. I did it around. I remember very well when. It was around, let's say, the 2/3 of the piece. Not that I decided that was the moment for, let's say, stressful reasons. No, it was not that. It was because I knew enough about all the scales and modes and things that I would use, spectral or ring modulation, because I'm using quite a lot of varied material that I would use for the piece. Let's say I knew that I would not have that much surprises later on, that I would not use all of a sudden one scale that I never used before. So I could have done it before, actually, but I was quite amused by this way of proceeding. And one reason is that, also I didn't speak that much about that, it was the formal impact of this method of work. What was it? It's not difficult to understand. Actually, the succession of sections, of the scenario was going on, and I thought that it was very interesting for me to have a kind of panoramic view of what would happen dramatically, from the point of view of the registers and so on, and then to decide which scale, which chord would perfectly fit to this section that you would retrieve in another one, and so on. You know what I mean? So the orchestration by the means of pitches was making sense once I was really advanced in the scenario. You know, as at the moment you know that an actor must come, but which one, and you know which one. Okay? So I think that it was because of the formal impact that I chose to do it quite late, but not too late. And also because I knew that there would be not so much surprise, because I knew the casting, I would say, from other pitches. You know, that was all. I think I hope it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question, maybe, or shall I go ahead? Sorry, this is the emotional moment. I'm drinking water. So. Yes. Edu.
So I have kind of a, maybe it's a complicated question, but
I love them.
so because you sketched out, you kind of outlined kind of how you went about doing this and then adding the notes. I'm curious if you found now in hindsight the way
Sorry, I didn't understand.
in hindsight, now that you're able to look back on the piece
in retrospect,
how the form of the harmony, how it unfolded, how it affected your perception of the kind of unfolding of the form, and to what degree were you made aware of certain problems that maybe you didn't see before?
Which kind of problems?
I don't know. I'm asking. That's my question. I mean, so this way of working, right? So you're not accessing pitches right away. So I'm asking because you have the formal plan basically laid out.
Well,
so,
yes. There are always some mystery. You know, I'm not feeling my measures. You know what I mean? So I'm not working like that. It's not that predictable. I mean, I had planned more or less. Yes,
right. So no, but that's what I mean. So in working this way and then coming at it later, how did it affect the relationship between the pitches and the rhythms, and how did that impact the overall form, and what issues did you find, if any, arose?
Well, the good news is I had no issues.
Great.
And the second one is that it's the opposite, actually. It's not that some formal, let's say, surprises, because you're right. I mean, I would call them more surprises than issues. But, you know, we are excited by surprises. I don't know for you, but for me it's exciting. And it's true that one thing appeared is that I had to choose carefully which scale, also which degree, I did not speak about that because it's not my main goal today, but which degree of microtonality could be integrated in a distorted gesture, for instance. So it was much more, let's say, the question of choice and how you choose a color towards another. So the degree of, let's say, of dissonance of a chord, of diatonism and chromatism in a chord, if it was tempered, or what was the capacity I had in terms of instruments to integrate some microtonality, fake unisons, you know what I mean, those kind of things in the musical discourse in order to find a kind of equivalent in terms of complexity of sound in the domain of pitches. So this is more a question of, let's say, choice of quality sometimes, but it's true that the main impact, in order to respond maybe clearly to one aspect of your question, was that I knew that because I knew the scenario and what was, for instance, reappearing at one point, how I would choose, for instance, the same scale, and how I would definitely abandon one of them. You know what I mean? So it's true that, of course, after a while, when you don't have any system, because we didn't even pronounce the word, which means something. Absence means something sometimes. Yes, it's true that without any system, I am totally devoted, let's say, to a logic which is morphologic, which is about speed, about thickness, about grain, let's say, grain of timbre, but also grain of harmony, and how I can find rugosity, transparency, which is, you know what I mean? Also, it's true that I did not want, and I think you can hear it, did not want to avoid what might sound like as a consonance sometimes, or something reminiscent of a consonant world sometimes, because I thought, and I remain convinced, if you want, that when you're working and focusing on one aspect of the material, which is here more or less the complexity of the degree of spectral complexity, let's say, due to complex sound, it creates a kind of focus which is centrifuge enough in order to afford a kind of variety of pitches. That's something to be a balance which is hard to find, but it's exciting because when you have one project or one concept which is you think is strong enough, you might feel that it's federating enough. I think in the case of spectral music, it was the process. The process had a kind of sacred or magic power of integrating many, many things. And you can see that in Partiel by Griset, for instance. I think it's an example of unified piece with heterogenic material very often. Despite of the fact that he's focusing on the spectrum and on the process, it's true that you have many, many things that are not necessarily expected in his piece, but still unified. So, and that's a part of my, let's say, ambition even the next decades. In 50 years, I will do another conference about that. The idea is to be able to, for me, the ambition, to build a music which is not necessarily relying on refusal in order to build an identity. It's not for going against the refusal that I'm doing that. But I think that it's for me, it's more desirable, if you want, to have a music or to elaborate a music where none of the musical dimensions are really neglected, so that aesthetically you have a wider palette of emotions, if you want. Because when the material is reduced, my guess, it's not a theorem, of course, that also the aesthetic purpose is reduced. That there would be a relationship, if you want, between the economy of means and what happens aesthetically. But that's maybe another seminar in 50 years. So
Cool. Well, thank you.
Okay. So I think that I respond more or less,
Yes.
even though it's a wide
It's a big question,
range of
yeah.
yes. So I wanted to now to maybe emphasize before starting. I think we have until 6, right? So I thought that for the last 30 minutes we would discuss with Carmine about orchestration assisted. But before that, I wanted to show a few means, let's say, of going beyond the constraints, the physical constraints almost, of the complex sounds into the instrumental world. Why? Because I think that we're all dealing with those kind of things when we are using complex sounds. And I would start with a sentence that I like by Henri Matisse, who said that exactitude is not the truth. In other terms, it's not because you are reproducing equally the same sounds, here complex sounds, which are difficult to control, that you're going into a kind of solidity of the aesthetics. That's kind of the truth, you know what I mean. And I did not start my work with complex sounds thinking of this at all. But I like very much this sentence because I think in new music we are all obsessed, or at least maybe less now, but there is still a kind of culture of precision. Obsessive culture of precision, let's say. But once again, it could be a whole seminar, but the object of a whole seminar. But I think an interesting notation, an interesting precision in music is a precision which, of course, allows the musician to go as close as possible as what you want and what the score wants. But especially in case of more kind of gestural material, which allows the approximation to still make sense. In other terms, it's not because you're playing not exactly the right multiphonics with exactly the same pitches that were put on the score that you're destroying the sense of the musical discourse, its solidity. Why? I always take this partial, that's the case, example, but quite telling, of the moment when in Partiel by Griset you have this bassoon, contrabassoon reed, which is played in the French horn and gives a sound which is very, say, electric, saturated, or kind of electric guitar, and where the pitch is never the same. So I think that's one example where Griset was very aware that, of course, here the timbre was more making sense in terms of musical discourse than the pitches. And he was a spectralist, so he could have been, you know what I mean. But anyway, you have an approximation which is very acceptable and respectable because it does not destroy the whole logic of the whole thing. Yes. So, how did I end up, let's say, thinking of trying to articulate, if you want, my thoughts about how to preserve the sense of the discourse, including this approximation. And I ended up with some, let's say, once again, I don't like the word concept. It's a big word. Let's say some ideas about what would be heard in my music first, let's say, in order to make sense horizontally in terms of succession of events. And I end up thinking about instrumental density, which means how much I can measure and dose the degree of, let's say, yes, density of, is everybody playing at the same time? Is there only one musician, chamber group or something within the orchestra and so on? And those kind of things are very well understood by the listener. So that was one of the things, how to vary the musical situation so that there is a kind of coloration of this melody of timbre by the means of hierarchies between group and musical situations in terms of associations of timbres. Another idea was the degree of activity. How to measure, for me, the energy that I was feeling was quite important in my music because using a lot of complex sounds means a lot of efforts, most of the time. Lots of control, a kind of virtuosity, not a digital virtuosity, but a virtuosity of control, let's say, which is not exactly the case. It's colored by retention more than liberation. It's not the same, okay? Not the same kind of energy. So how to measure the degree of activity? And of course, sorry for those who had a private lesson with me yesterday because I spoke about that a little bit, or before yesterday. It's true that you can have a huge degree of activity with, say, a kind of hectic solo, but in the case of in the case of the solo, the instrumental density is extremely reduced. Okay, and you can have a bunch of 80 musicians only playing one chord with absolutely no life, rhythmic life in sound inside, and only lasting sounds. So it's degree 1, let's say, of degree of activity with a high instrumental density and so on. So all those kind of things can be articulated in order to shape the phrasing. At least, I think, in my music. I hope so. Another one would be what we call, I think now, a spectral complexity. How much the texture is filled with complex sounds and frequencies or not. And I think in this piece itself, I think it's quite clear. Sometimes you have a pure moment of harmony where each individuality is a pure sound, if you want. Of course, generally I don't use very simple chords. In terms of coherency, it wouldn't make sense, I think. But it's important for me to have this capacity to reduce the spectral complexity within the musical discourse. So I need contrasts. That's the thing. And the last, let's say, maybe it's going to be enriched in the future, but the last idea was about parallelism of activity. Even if you have a high degree of activity, if you want, it can be the same or not. of course, a normal rhythmic situation is a great parallelism, but also with a high degree of activity and very different ways of articulating the density. You might end up with very individual actions. So you don't have parallelism at all. Okay? So those kind of things help me, if you want, articulating a musical discourse, I think, which I don't want to be always fusing. Because once again, acoustically, the complex sounds have a tendency to fuse. That's something which is almost a kind of law, if you want. And having a one-layer music always is a little bit of a problem for me. Why? Because formally it condemns you to have a succession of sections. And when you have counterpoint and several layers, you can have some, let's say, back and forth, kind of ambiguity about what is to be listened or not, and also some kind of what we call tuilage. I don't know what's the translation of that in English. Some kind of entanglements, let's say.
Dovetail.
Sorry?
Dovetail, or like the tail of a dove.
Yes, exactly.
Like this.
Yes, I think it helps if you want doing those kind of let's say entanglements and all those kind of things. So one of the goals I have, and especially let's say in it's easier with orchestra to have a contrapuntal approach and with ensembles, but in chamber music, and especially with solo pieces, it's not that easy. And I always tried in my solo pieces to have several layers of information and trajectories, despite of the fact that the degree of spectral complexity was supposed to be high, if you want. And that I don't lose what I like very much in the repertoire, to be honest, is the capacity of a solo instrument to be followed in very different ways, not in one layer, if you want. And of course, with some instruments, it's easier to do than with others, but it's still a goal for me, it's still an ambition to still write with complex sounds, because I like that. It's like an addiction, if you want. Well, you have worse addictions in the world. But in the meantime, not abandoning the contrapuntal feeling and listening. So, any questions? Yes? Robert? I know everybody in the audience, almost.
Thanks, Franck. This goes back a little bit to the first part of your talk, but I feel like it's relevant here. You said that you found that complex sounds that didn't have a function would stick out and feel like cliches. And that word
yes,
has
well,
been
not only
nagging
complex
me.
sounds, I mean,
I guess
any kind of
anything.
sound, as you know.
Could you expand a little bit more on what is a function for you? How those sounds come to have maybe a role in the form or a role in the piece?
Okay.
What it means for them to be functional?
Okay, so it's related to this melody of timbre, let's say a permanent melody of timbre, kind of massive melody of timbre that I'm trying to elaborate. One thing is that it's a lot about colors and quality of texture, which means degree of thickness. Really kind of visual art reference for once with me. It's not very often, but the case. I don't use that much those kind of analogies because I think that you can make them say a little bit what you want. So, but I'll try to explain that way. In terms of material, in terms of thickness and speed and allure and morphologies, actually. Morphologies maybe is the best word because morphology is a complex thing which varies like a kaleidoscope in my mind. So, within the kaleidoscope of the melody of timbre that I'm trying to elaborate, each sound, complex sound, will have will be a kind of atom of which serves a certain feeling. Let's say, feeling is a complex word, but the feeling is that you're dealing with rugosity, with transparency, and so on, and all these qualities of colors, if you want. But of course, if it was isolated, it would not make sense. So what is my goal? I feel, at least for me, once again, but you ask for my music how it works, that each complex sound carries with it a promise, or let's say a dream, maybe, which is to create the final fusion, if you want. Each solo, which is, let's say, fragmented between pitches and complex sounds, because complex sounds appear permanently, actually. They have a degree of complexity acoustically, which tends to overwhelm the line and to take over the pitch feeling, the pitchy feeling. And very often in my music, you will have what I would call not climaxes, but points of differentiation, where each moment of fusion, and sometimes we have them, is called by those individuals. So actually, each complex sound has a certain quality in terms of speed, of color, of, let's say, thickness and rugosity and things like that, which is the promise of what's going to happen in terms of fusion of the ensemble and fusion of the orchestra. Each complexity, individual, carries the dream of an impossible fusion, if you want, to try to speak in a, let's say, a melodic way. Actually, I'm envisaging each complex sound as a part of a puzzle, which will be, at one point, filled by the whole orchestra. And is a moment of liberation and resolution, if you want. So each, paradoxically, let's say, each complex sound is the promise of a resolution, with a lot of tension, generally, but it happens that it's not necessarily fortissimo, of course. And where the music is going back and forth between this dream of fusion and the fragmentation, which is always a little bit tragic in the sense that everybody is, each instrument possibly is alone with this fragment of the whole puzzle. And that's how I feel it. I feel like a kind of uncompleted melody, or uncompleted, let's say, harmony of, if you extend the notion of harmony, of course, a harmony of complex sound, a wall of sound, which has its own fragments delivered before, and within, or before, let's say, the most, the simplest way of speaking about that would be to have a sound of a flute, which is very pure, without any complexity, and where progressively within the piece you have the voice coming in, plus a multiphonic plus the voice, plus a trill in terms of degree of activity, or transparent, or rugosity, and all those kind of things, put together in one, and one instrument possibly becomes a part of the final fusion, let's say, or final fusion, or kind of possible fusion of the ensemble. And what does it bring? Why would it fusion so important? Why is it so important for me? Because it has the formal quality of a resolution, federating the whole thing, and also of extrapolation, which means that very often it will be as one instrument, which becomes kind of an emergence, which becomes another instrument, and works with a kind of paradoxical position where you have the resolution because you have the complete frame of complexity, and in the meantime the idea that this complexity, because of the quality of the sound, is unstable and carries its own destruction. So it's a lot about colors and drama, and I think that if you were to ask me in terms of quantifying, let's say, the degree of, let's say, of complexity for each sound, maybe I could do scales of complexity of timbre and so on, but I was not excited by this perspective that much. Why? I think that I like to keep, first I think that it's not that easy to find, I don't think that structuralist methods work with complex sounds that much. In other terms, it's not sure that we invented yet the reasonable, let's say, tools of analysis for this kind of material. After all, we did not invent, I think, a theatrical degree of one gesture or another. Am I wrong? I don't think so. That does exist. So that's exciting for me to keep the mystery. And it's true that a lot of things are intuitive. But if you were to ask me about the function on the long term, it's true that this back and forth between, let's say, purity is in a very literal, let's say, with no connotation, word, and the, let's say, rugosity, it's really like a kind of melody of timbre which finds its resolution possibly later. But in between, you have a lot of correspondences between let's say, the breathing tones delivered by the flutes, for instance, at a certain speed, and the breathing tones, or so-called breathing tones of the strings that might take over. So a lot of correspondence. And what I would call, let's say, a kind of crossed counterpoint, where you have the choice of listening to the pitches and in the meantime to listening to the timbral evolution, which might be contradictory. So it's a kind of oblique counterpoint, or I don't know, where you have the choice of following the timbral evolution or the pitch evolution, because there are some, or rhythmic ones, not, let's say, forgetting any of them. And it's a balance which I'm interested in, of course, because as long as there are some pitches threatened by timbre, or let's say by noise, and the opposite, it creates really a kind of tension between them. And this tension is the source of, possibly a source of drama. So I'm conscious that I'm responding in a more metaphoric way, but I feel that in music we have a lot of things that we cannot be quantified, and as a composer, at least I chose not to be afraid of that. You know what I mean? So, but then again, I have the impression that it's something that will evolve in my vocabulary. But I try not to be too explicit about that, because when you force the explanation, you end up with concepts that are a little bit some kind of prisons, you know? So it should come naturally. For instance, this vocabulary that I'm using now about degree of activity and things like that, I could not speak about that 10 years ago. Why? Because I think I was not ready to explain necessarily the things that we are, a part of our brain when you're composing is always in advance, and that's fortunate, I think, on the explanation. If my music was the illustration of the explanation, I would be sad, I think. That would worry me a lot, I think. But maybe some people are much more structuralist here than I am. But I think that illustrating a concept is not an ambition for me. No. Once again, it comes from the fact that for me, music has its own contents, which is not more stupid than another art, you know what I mean? So, does someone have any questions? Yes, please. I don't know your name, but you're going to tell it very soon.
Hi, I'm Lan Qian. I just wanted to ask, do you see a complex sound as opposed to the traditional idea of harmony, or maybe possibly an extension of harmony? Because harmony, I see it as putting different sounds together, right? And then complex sounds is just putting lots of different sounds together. I don't know what you think about this.
Yes, what I call spectral density, actually, if you want to. I mean, lots of frequencies put together. But do I see it as an extension? Only. If it was only an extension, that's a very interesting question. The final result would not be something else than the sum of what has been added, if you want, of everything. You know what I mean? But I think that when you're adding complex sounds, and I think I spoke about it very briefly, unfortunately, with my former colleague, David Wessel, at University of California, Berkeley, was telling me that some musical elements are still mysterious. For instance, the glissando does not fit into any kind of category harmonically, really. What is it? Is it a passage to one pitch to another? Yes, certainly. But after that, does it bring kind of suspension, feeling of suspension, of destruction of the harmonic feeling? Not sure. I did not read a lot of things about that, by the way. So, in terms of complex sound, you are touching something very precious, actually, which is the idea of extrapolation of emergence, which means that by adding some layers of complex sounds, you're reaching something which is not equal to the sum of the different parts. Does that make sense? And that's the charm of it, if you want. I feel that, well, in the score that I showed to you, but also with other composers, I feel sometimes that by adding layers of complexity, kind of counterpoint of complexity, we reach a point of what I called, with some other composers, saturation of the space, of the acoustic quality, which tends to erase the identities. And when you erase the identities, it's not like if you have a chord, or let's say, of 26 notes, you know what I mean, which would be more interesting than the one of 5 notes, let's say. It's not necessarily more interesting. It depends, once again, on the function that you give to this chord. So, by adding several layers of complexity, I'm preparing the extrapolation. And that's what is exciting for me. Dealing with, once again, a word that I did not pronounce so far, with ambiguity. Because as long as you're playing with ambiguity, you're playing with mystery, and if you're fortunate enough or skilled enough, the combination between 3 bassoons who are playing very fast trills with voice inside might sound like an electric guitar and makes a reference to a different world, really. So there is an extrapolation which is reachable by the means of this accumulation. The logic of accumulation, paradoxically, might tend to erase identities. And that's what interests me in the accumulation of complex sounds, if you want. It brings something which is not reducible to a sum of atoms, let's say. That's the thing, I think.
Thank you.
Another question? So, we still have a bit of time. So, I would like to maybe go further in the direction of what I call the tools, actually. And it's true that few things help me. So I lost the connection with my screen. Oh, thank you. 2 things which for me are typical of the work that I'm doing, transposed to the orchestra. Because what I said so far is a lot about ensembles and chamber music. You can do that. But, of course, one of the difficulties for the chamber music is that the identities are very pronounced. They are soloists mainly. But they have a lot of flexibility and virtuosity. And you can have a great interaction with them. But for the orchestra, it's another story, because maybe you have less time of rehearsal. There might be very strong musicians, but the context does not allow you to have exactly the same quality of, let's say, the personality of each instrument is not the same. The role is not the same. So they are not behaving like 80 soloists, of course. So, 2 problems. Yes, Edo, problems. that I wanted to avoid was this kind of rhythmic resistance and lack of phrasing that comes out when you're playing with multiphonic and crush tone and so on. Why am I speaking about that today? It's because we are in an academy where we have the concert, as I told you earlier, on Saturday, with very interesting pieces, full of surprises, and also full, well, depends, but of complex sounds. So I'm not inventing the fact that I think it's of any interest for young composers, I think. So, what are the things that I've been dealing with and the difficulties when you treat a certain material? Because I don't know any material which is fantastic enough and doesn't need to be written and elaborated. It's the same for a chord, a perfect chord. You will have problems, to avoid the same word, that different than with the complex sounds, but you have some. So I thought that there were two, well, let's say even one issue mainly, is that you cannot ask to musicians in the orchestra to behave like soloists of chamber music, which means to have a lot of quick changes of behavior, let's say, changes of embouchure, for instance, or go from one position of the bow to another one very quickly, and so on. Why? Because the energy that you would ask if you were doing so would be the one of a soloist. So you cannot transform a member of a team, let's say, into a soloist. Well, what the main tool that I'm using is not new, because it does exist in the repertoire. And it might surprise you, but I listen to a lot of Ravel and Mendelssohn for that. Yes, Mendelssohn is not maybe the most saturated guy you can find, but anyway, I like very much his, yes, but you can imagine that the fluentness of the orchestra of Mendelssohn or the fluentness of the orchestra of Ravel is very spectacular, very spectacular. Sometimes you even have the impression that it's not written, so fluent it is, you know what I mean? So you know where are my references. No, this is very important to understand this, let's say, some people will speak politics, if I was more from the Lachenmann side, which to consider that each transformation to the member of a, let's say, of a group to a soloist is already a kind of political gesture that you cannot reach, actually, with an orchestra. There is this kind of rigidity, if you want. So, one of the tools which I use a lot, I must say, is the division of tasks, actually. I'm absolutely avoiding, well, generally I'm avoiding, let's say, to find an example, to have the same group changing very often, let's say, the technique that he's using. And I prefer, in this piece and in other ones, I preferred to really analyze the morphology that I wanted and to distribute, let's say, every element of the final morphology to a special group. If it's for the strings, it's not difficult to see on the score, but also for the winds. And that's why generally I'm writing each part individually. Not for the strings that much, because you cannot divide eternally. Well, it's possible, but I did not want to have necessarily that sound for this piece. And divisions allow you to avoid the rhythmic resistance problem, of course. You might not have exactly the same massive effect, but you're transforming the space of the orchestra by the means of division into a panoramic chamber music space. So it is even more important with complex sounds because you don't want to have permanent changes and this awkwardness, okay? So by using some kind of superimposed gestures and textures, but individual, you are distributing different kinds of energies to different people, and the final result might be quite fluent, I think. You know, so that's when we speak a lot. One speaks a lot about the necessity of writing differently with the orchestra rather than the ensemble. But generally, nobody tells you how. Oh, you should not write the same way. Yes, okay, but how? So, dividing tasks, and by dividing tasks, I'm emphasizing on one thing, because most of the time when we think of divisions, generally in the repertoire, it's more for adding some more pitches in a chord. But not only, of course, if you look at Debussy, it's not the case always, or things like that. But generally, the rhythmic energy is quite parallel. But in terms of divisions with complex sounds, you can really create each time an organism, let's say, which would allow you to have the same kind of, hopefully a kind of rivalry in terms of flexibility, rhythmic flexibility between the ensemble and an orchestra. You know, so I think from that point of view, the orchestra has nothing to fear. If you find the right divisions to do and the right way of distributing the tasks and the functions within, who is doing the accent, who has the harmonic role, who has the dynamic role, who has the rhythmic one, it's very clear in your head, then the morphologies are once again a puzzle in which each group divided has its function. So that's one thing. Another thing that I found might be a problem, but it was much before working with the orchestra. I was a little bit frustrated. I was a lot frustrated, actually, when I was younger, about this kind of lack of phrasing when it comes to complex sounds. Many pieces that I would hear would integrate the complex sounds, but not with the same phrasing, the same ambitious phrasing than the normal, what a terrible word, normal sounds. In other terms, for instance, a multiphonic would forget the vibrato, would forget the trill, would forget many, many things that of course you cannot have exactly the same kind of flexibility for a multiphonic that for a normal sound. But it's possible to obtain, once again, with coordination, kind of creative coordination, if you want, the illusion of this flexibility that you might find with an ensemble, especially. With chamber music, it's a bit different. It's really virtuosic. But with an ensemble, generally you have a balance. Also, there are moments where you have very good surprises with the orchestra in terms of rhythmic coordination. Why? For instance, I see a lot of scores of younger and less young composers full of tremolos. And generally, the rhythmic information is quite poor, which means that you hear sextuplet most of the time. And the fact that on the score it's written with a magic oblique sign doesn't help that much. You still hear quintuplet, septuplet, and sextuplet. Okay. So, once again, the rhythm of the animation of sound has to be written down very carefully. That's what my feeling. So in terms of phrasing, in terms of life of sound, what I wanted is to have several ways of animating the sound. It can be from tremolo to trill, to vibrato, to what I call introvert rhythm, full of accents within a lasting sound, all this kind of thing. Combinations of them, sometimes vibrato for certain instruments, vibrato plus trill, for the flute, for instance, will really make sense. It creates texture, really, a superposition of two speeds. Those kind of things will always help, and you must find the right mixture in order to make it. So I think that it's a very, what we say in France, tarte à la crème, to think that, oh, yes, it's true, the orchestra is more rigid from the point of view of integrating colors and sound. But believe me or not, I'm sure that it's also our task to be able to imagine combinations that will create a certain result with complex sounds or not. Once again, I would like to advertise a little bit. In the concert that you will hear Saturday, no, because I was during the during the academy, I'm more or less a new music critic because I'm criticizing what I think might be improved. But also, you have in the concert of Saturday, you will have some pieces which integrate some really new colors, some things that I did not necessarily heard before, which are not combinations of complex, so-called complex techniques or complex sounds, but by the means of speed, the way it's performed, by the means of a kind of unusual interval, or bow speed, which is different. Just only one element or two elements combined can create a texture which is very doable at the orchestra for everybody, and which does not require any kind of supplemental effort. So you might find me optimistic. That's maybe why I like so much to compose at the moment when I'm optimistic. But I think that I don't think, if you want, that the orchestra is necessarily a kind of point of no return for ambition in terms of timbre. That's the thing. But it's true that one has to find exactly the right gesture that will distort, in the sense of, let's say, modifying, distort the usual sound for something which is quite spectacular in the best sense of the term. I will take the example of a composer that I like very much, or at least certain pieces of his, is a piece called Stelle by Georges Courtag, where when you see the score, it's not like Mendelssohn almost. I mean, you see almost nothing in the score. I mean, nothing spectacular really. And the sound is, I would say, cosmic, really. Very spectacular in terms of, let's say, density of the orchestra, and in the meantime, light feeling of transparency. You have the impression of being on the moon. Really, it's something which really needs to be heard. I think it's the second movement. Yes, I think it's the second movement. It's kind of depressive, abandoned gesture, really, which is, in the meantime, very light and very beautiful and cosmic, really. And this is quite spectacular, but it's only done with very economic means. No, I think that in terms of, but it's very vertical. That's the thing. What does it mean? It means that I think some of the problems might come out when you are dealing with the melodic dimension. And I would like to speak a little bit about that. Because when it comes to verticality and vertical gestures only, dealing with the complex sounds world is not impossible. And even if you don't use complex sounds, because I don't think that in this piece by Courtag you have any complex special technique. It's only combination of timbre and harmonic disposal. You have something which is very important, and to deal with the, let's say, melodic dimension, especially in a human time. What I feel is that most of the people are okay with very stretched time when it comes to create timbre. Well, if you have a good ear and things like that, it's very doable. Also with high speed moment, because it creates a kind of acoustic illusion where the figures are mixing very well into an acoustic illusion which creates a texture. So paradoxically, the speed becomes a tool for elaborating timbre. But when it comes to the medium speed, which is the speed of the human voice, where all the unconscious memories of or culture of vocal voice and instrumental world being a metaphoric proposal for the voice, then we have more problems, more issues. So, what are the solutions that I have tendency to adopt, I would say? I did not want for my music that and I heard that sometimes in some pieces. I want to avoid that. That's true. That the complexity of timbre might be manifest without playing with words in the vertical dimension, but quite poor when it comes to melody. So that you have a melodic world which is a succession of pitches mainly, or gestures at the best, but does not match horizontally the complexity and the richness, let's say, of the vertical world. That's something that one can understand. So what happens in those cases when there is a richness of the verticality and a kind of rudimentary treatment of the melody in terms of timbre? But you have an accompanying melody, figure on a background. And that's, I find, very poor and very disappointing to elaborate something which is very rich and creating sonic illusions, and in the meantime, having something very down to earth, which is just a melody who has lost its accompaniment. So, you might disagree, but I would like to have opposite voices. Don't be too respectful. I think that that's something which is at stake. How being coherent, if you decide to focus on complex sounds, and how to focus on, you know what I mean, on, and I think microtonal composers have the almost same kind of issues, you know what I mean? How to deal with melody when you are okay with the harmonic dimension because you have more time, but when it comes to melodic invention, microtonality is slightly more of a problem. So how to deal with those kind of things? One or two solutions that I proposed in this piece actually, is to deal with a kind of what Griset called a solo pour deux, which means mixing a melody with two instruments or three instruments, and the whole thing, the whole line, is conceived as a solo, but where everybody is playing so that you feel that there is only one instrument. That's a solution. There are others. Of course, the high virtuosity of one soloist. Or the preparation of the instrument. For instance, in the case of the piano, you have some kind of opposite sonorities where you have the Scotch tape, which is on the high pitches, and where a part is not prepared. So you have both, one staccato, one prepared, and it creates a mixture within the same instrument. Sometimes it really helps, even in medium speed, those kind of things. So, actually, it's possible to reach the same degree of requirement, I would say, in terms of timbre when it comes to horizontal matter and melodic matter. But you have to reinvent, let's say, I think, we have to reinvent the notion of responsibility of each musician. That, as I told some of the students, I think that a melodic line, at least with the orchestra, I don't speak for chamber music because now the virtuosity has reached a point which is quite impressive. But for the orchestra, I think that the distribution of tasks, also in terms of melodic matter, is extremely useful in order to avoid this kind of rigidity, which tends to prevent you of having the same flexibility of rhythmic flexibility or timbral flexibility. Because if you were to ignore that constraint, you would try to transform each musician into a soloist, which is impossible barely. So, of course, there are other solutions that I did not think of, and it's still something which is going on for me, because after all, I did not speak enough, and maybe I did not speak of it intentionally, and look how my sense of transition is very strong. I did not speak about electronics that much for helping, you know, the process. I hope you appreciate. So, integrated the electronics with orchestra. It was in 2016, actually, and the piece will be played next year with Manifest at the Philharmonie. And of course, electronics is a way of transforming the sound in a very, let's say, efficient way. Sometimes you're dealing with degree of electricity, let's say, in the acoustic sound, and it's fascinating. Some people work with transducers. Some, you know what I mean? You have a bunch of solutions. I mean, it's only up to our imagination, actually, I would say. And in the case of my piece, well, that you won't listen today because I didn't have the time to have both pieces played, I think, the electronic transformation is certainly a way of dealing with transformation of timbre, that's for sure. But I don't think we should stay satisfied with that. I heard one of two pieces which were dealing with electronics in real time, but they were very stretched time pieces. And that worked because you had the time to hear the transformation very, very well. But in terms of dealing with individual lines at different speeds, sometimes it can be very complicated. That's my feeling. I mean, maybe some people here at IRCAM, Jean Lechard might want to contradict me. Oh, no, he doesn't want. It never happens. So I think that this is still an experimental territory. That's good news because we're here for that also. If everything was to be already invented, that would be a problem. But I guess that the role of electronics, for me, appeared to be crucial in the second piece, that you won't hear today, because I felt that you could add another level of preparation. The only thing, I guess, at least for my music, that I would not be satisfied with, it would be to have, let's say, a kind of globally normal traditional writing for the instrumental world, and in the meantime to have, from the other side, a very ambitious dispositive that would allow me to transform the sound, if you want. I think it might work in stretch time situations, but when it comes to very recognizable articulations, and especially the speed of the human voice, then it becomes more difficult to deal with, let's say, something that works vertically for stretch time. I think the speed is one of the things that render the transformations quite difficult when you're not adding another level of transformation. And the thing that I did in the other piece was not to have any kind of, let's say, backstepping in terms of transformation of the acoustic transformation of the instruments. You have many instruments that are prepared. Some of them are electric. There is an electric guitar and things like that. A different degree of electricity for some instruments, some groups. And in the meantime, you have the real-time transformation and the tape. So I think that by using all these different dimensions of the role of the electronics, I think for me, dealing with all speeds of the musical discourse was doable. You might not agree. You will tell me next year. But when you hear, if you hear the piece, but I think that it's something which is still to be experienced, and we will speak about that now. Maybe a short conclusion about, I would say, aesthetically. The word saturation, I use at one point a lot. There was a kind of misunderstanding because I think it was felt by, at least in France, as a kind of post-rock aesthetic, if you want. You know what I mean? Because saturation in the mind of people, it was necessarily electricity and so on. And for me, it was a reference more to two things. Color, as a color can be saturated, of course, and excess. And the idea of the dramatic idea, the aesthetic idea behind this elaboration, what is that? Is to give a sense to excess, if you want, excess of information, which extrapolates and transforms a timbre into another, and creates, I would say, what the excess brings when it's articulated can be poetically of great interest for me, at least. You know what I mean? So articulation of excess was something which led me to elaborate more and more in that direction, even though it questions my writing in terms of control. But once again, I think that approximation shall be given a function within the musical precision. That's, I think, for me, at least the key. So I don't know if you have any questions, because for me, I'm done, and I would like to open the discussion with Carmine. I don't know if you have any questions now about what I said. Edu? Always the same. I'm kidding. Don't forget to amplify yourself.
That's yeah, I definitely need that. Anyway, no. So at one point you made a distinction between sound design and composition. And
that's typical. The very tricky question at the last minute.
I've been saving it all this time.
I hope you appreciate for your future masterclasses and so on. It's always the case.
Yeah.
Yes, please. And you're remaining very polite in any situation.
Right.
Okay, please go ahead. Just for make you comfortable.
Sure. No, I feel extra comfortable now. It's great. No, but you made this distinction, and I'm curious what that is, where the line is for you, and what function that serves to have this distinction.
Okay, what the very last.
And why is it meaningful to have this distinction?
It has to do with the concert situation. Once, whether you want it or not, sorry for those who already hear me about this topic, but I'm repeating myself. It's part of being older. Fortunately, I guess that whether you want it or not, you have a beginning to your piece, and you have an ending, and in between, maybe some reasons delivered for you to start and to end. Like in life, you're finding your existential, let's say, meaning. So, from that point of view, it seems to me that an elaboration of sound, let's say, which, because we're speaking a lot about, let's say, timbre today, because the topic of the material and so on, which only creates a succession of nice sound, nice combinations, nice colors, without any kind of, let's say, possible justification of the proportions, for instance, within the concert situation, tends to be sound design, not composition. In terms of just dealing with the fact that it begins and it ends, if you're not giving enough function, or a function which is strong enough to those combinations or possible actions, sonic actions that are delivering sonic complexity, you're falling into a kind, it seems to me, decorative purpose, where everything is local, and which is heard as a kind of ephemeral beauty, if you want. Whilst I always try, it's true, to forget about the inner beauty of a chord, or say of a gesture, instrumental gesture, because some gestures are very beautiful, I mean, not only necessarily virtuosic, or to forget about the beauty of a timbre, or a combination of timbre, and try to make sense why the next 10 seconds will happen. So that's, I think, a constraint which is due to the concert situation. I think. I wouldn't say that it's a problem, but I think if you're dealing with a concert music situation, then that might be a problem, because there is no reason otherwise that your piece is ending or finishing. There is a drama of sound, and I think ignoring this as if it did not exist, it's a little bit of an issue for me. Because I don't feel that I'm here for good reasons necessarily. Silent in a concert hall for, you know, I think the concert situation has to create some kinds of constraint. And I think what's in between the beginning and the ending should make sense in terms of evolution, if you want. And that's why I would say the necessity of an architecture, if you want. It's because of the concert situation constraint. Is that okay?
That's great. Thank you.
Next question. No, I mean, if it's okay, maybe we have a little bit of time for Carmine to join us. And I think this is, for me, very informative because I mean, Carmine is going to speak about software. Yes, I think more or less. Let's say his approach, but which includes at least the software,
Yes,
which was elaborated here at IRCAM, and I think it's quite new in terms of, let's say, it does not have 30 years old. And about. He's going to speak about that much better than I will. But I thought it would be interesting to have him propose us some kind of other methods and other tools in order to, once again, reinvent the relationship we have with, let's say, the orchestra, for instance, which is very old but extremely rich and possibly very, very new, if you want, in terms of approach. I think the approach should be new in order to renew the material, whatever it is. I will always give this example, and after that I will let you speak, about what I call sometimes as the opposite of melancholy, saying, oh, everything has been done, blah, 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 like the old people, you know. Oh, they all look the same, by the way. And like, well, I won't go that much in that direction. But I think that if you want the melancholy, which tends to say, oh, everything has been done and everything, I think it's not acceptable for me. It's a bitterness. And the opposite would be to be extremely joyful each time you have a new tool, a new toy with you. You know what I mean? Say, oh, that's the tool of my life. I'm going to do a great piece with it. So, and it leads us to what I call surface modernity, which means a fascination for the last toy, which is poorly connected in terms of aesthetics, if you want. So, of course, us composers, we're all in between, new tools that are possibly exciting, but also possibly sterile if you don't have the imagination. And of course, the melancholic position, which tends to think, okay, I'm going to use only things that work the way they worked. And we are trying to find a creative path. I think it's difficult to contradict this. So, thank you, Carmine, for coming and speaking about a tool which you developed in a creative way.
So, first of all, thanks for your talk. It was really nice. You gave so much.
Thank you.
And in fact, I have so many questions. In fact,
now it's my turn.
I think that I will ask you a question instead. So let me start with, because today in the morning I presented somehow the approach and I presented somehow a point of view on orchestration and specifically on assisted orchestration. So we had some examples, but I'd like to address one topic here, that is maybe a way to connect orchestration and assisted orchestration, that is complexity. Okay, so that's the thing. So that's what I wanted to ask you. So I want to show just a picture. So when you showed your handwritten piece, I thought about this thing that so it's a piece of mine as well, in which I do, I suppose, something close to what you did, in the sense that, so for example, here the shapes are the spectral morphology of the thing. It's like when anything happens in the spectrum somehow. The colors are the layers of the orchestration, so which musical figures you use to interact. For example, you see that the violet and the green are different things. And then there is there are some symbols like playing styles that I detail afterwards in the score, and harmonies like the chords, like the P things like. So basically, and then on the right you see exactly the implemented things. So there is like 6 months in between. Okay, so it's like the idea and the way to implement it. And when I do this, I need to face the things that you spoke about. So this ambiguity between pitch and timbre, in a sense, because you need to face, you need to design a timbre, but you may eventually use harmonies on pitches. Okay, so I would to ask you questions about this and show you some examples about orchestration about that. So, for example, to me, I use this kind of dichotomy between composing with sound. With sounds and composing within a sound. In a sense, when you compose within the sound, you design the timbre. I assume, tell me if I'm wrong, that when you were sketching out your piece without notes, you were somehow composing within the sound, and then when you played or added notes, you started more composing also with sounds, like with together.
Yes, knowing that you're back and forth all the time.
Yes, exactly. You go. In fact, I do these arrows that go back and forth. Yeah. Okay. So my question is, maybe complexity is a keyword that can help us to connect the two words. Like, so I will banalize a bit the thing, but in a sense, you can reach the same complexity using a few complex units or more simple units. Somehow.
Yes,
it's possible. So let me play some samples, okay? For example, with assisted orchestration, something that is, at the moment working more is that we achieve complexity summing up simple units, okay? So let me play some samples here. I played this morning as well. So suppose this is the target that you want to, mimic with the orchestra. So it's a metallic sound, and then you generate an orchestration. So here, what we hear is a timbre contour. So it's the timbre. The shape of the timbre is close because of the dark instruments, the dark notes, and then there is also this strike, like the tam-tam strike, that gives you the attack of the sound. Okay. Of course, these if you see the score of these are just plain notes, ordinario. So there are not complex units. But in a sense, you can achieve a certain degree of complexity. For example, I was also playing these other samples. It is more fun. Okay, and then you try to orchestrate this sound, or like another solution. Okay, so here. What we try to...
It's funny because the energy is not the same at all.
Yeah,
anyway,
of
that's
course.
The thing. But the color, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
I'm trying to, exactly. What we focus
we can call that an energy. Yes.
Yeah, I suppose a girl screaming is somehow more,
it's not the same energy.
More important. Okay, but in any sense, what we focus here is about the timbre somehow, the timbre dimension, okay? In fact, when we try to orchestrate something that is more related to pitch, like, of course, Beethoven's is also related to timbre, but in a sense, here harmony is a dominant parameter, okay? When we orchestrate, we get solutions that are somehow harmonic, in which the pitch dimension wins on the timbre dimension, okay? So, or whatever. So we reorchestrate the thing. Okay. So the question I have, because what I do usually in music, so I really enjoyed the piece itself. Okay, your piece itself. The major difference. That's
what happens.
It's an effect that I. Yes. Okay. So basically, my way to reach complexity is through many simple units. I don't work a lot in complex sounds because I like a lot this approach, but it's still something that is not usually common for me. So what do you think about this? I mean, do you think that, for example, a tool like the tool that I showed now could help you in achieving your complexity, even if you sum up simple units, not complex units?
Well, yes, it would help for certain situations, I think, where the model is already in my mind quite identified in the case of, but it's true in the case of the bell, for instance. But it's true that for me, so far, I do not start with a very realistic, let's say, image of the sound that I want to obtain. That's, I mean, I'm not the only one in that case, I think. When I mix those complex sounds, it's true that there is something which tends to be experimental in the sense that I'm not, of course, I'm sure of what I want to hear, but it's not necessarily referring to an existing model. So maybe the ideal position for me would be to say that I would be happy to define first something which in my mind that I still don't know, and to find solutions that, but I don't know if it's possible with the software.
So basically you're saying, if I understand, that we have a target here that we want to approximate, but you also want to approximate a target that is abstract, that is not physically existing, like an image that you have in your mind, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So this is, of course, possible. We can read your mind and play the sound that you have inside. No,
full of surprises.
Yes, of course. So you put a helmet and you read your mind. No, in any sense, at the beginning of this project, that is started roughly in 2003, there were a lot of discussions about what could be a way to do assisted orchestration. And of course, one path was, I don't want to use a sound. I want to define an image that I have in my mind, for example, a set of musical constraints, a chord, a set of dynamics that I want to use, this kind of thing. And then speak about this idea in a musical sense, like brightness or either orchestral transparency. Yes, this kind of more abstract words, okay? But unfortunately, this is a very difficult way to formalize the problem. And so one easier way was, at the time, we give a model to the system. And the model is a sound, and we infer information from this model, okay? So this was just, let's say, a trade-off between these two. But in fact, what we would like to achieve is what you say, is like we would like to give the composer a means to express an image that he has in his mind, but without explicitly using a sound, but using, for example, some words that composer uses, for example. Like, I don't know, what I do here is when I think about...
for instance, sorry to interrupt, for the screaming that I like very much, there was one question that I thought, is that, of course, but maybe some of you had the same feeling, it was the degree of, I wouldn't say it doesn't exist, I think, but as a French person, I try to invent an English word, fleshiness of the sound. You know what I mean? The first sound was more fleshy, of course, than the result that you found. So how can you measure the degree of fleshiness in the, you know what I mean, of a sound? And those kind of abstract, let's say, I don't know even how to do it. So I don't know how the difference comes from.
Of course. So the point is that right. It's that's why I'm saying it's very difficult to have an abstract model, and it's easier to somehow mimic a physical, real sound target. But the idea is, and the question I'm asking myself and our composers is: can we define a dictionary of things on which we agree? And these are meaningful parameters that we can use to define, abstract targets, because this will be very helpful. Like, it's not composing. I mean, of course, when you speak, I mean, never two composers write the same music usually, so they hardly agree on something. But so my question is, can we find a meta level or a level of writing, not musical writing, but meta musical writing, in which we agree? For example, here in this page, I have three, colors that for me stands three layers in the orchestration. Okay, like transparency is something that we can think about. And so we want to achieve this chord that is more prominent and this other chord that is less prominent. For example, transparency could be a word, something like that. Absolutely. Yeah, and so because I'd like to ideally, it would be very nice to mix the way you use sounds, like the complex units, in a system that is able to handle complexity at this level, in which you just specify, for example, I want a sound that is, bright at this level of brightness, and is at the same time broad in the spectrum, like the bandwidth, and at the same time it has 3 layers, and one is this chord, and the second this chord, and the second this chord. But in the second layer, I won't only use these dynamics. This kind of constraints would be. This would be helpful for you as a composer?
Well, yes, and I think also that, the idea of starting with a model which is, let's say, mimetically
exactly.
Created, I think it's interesting, but it can also be distorted afterwards in an intuitive way. That's what I'm doing with, with chords, for instance, with a very different thing, with the Bach library that I'm using on Max 7SP. Very often the computer will give me an example, a disposition of chords, for instance, and after that I spend lots of time actually destroying more or less or reinterpreting what he proposed. And that would be my use, having the result that you showed, and in the meantime, adding some complex sounds and things like that are interesting. So I'm sure that I could possibly use this, and I'm not the only one, but probably I would add steps of elaboration and accumulation, I think, because it's my way of thinking, that's all.
I think it's really interesting.
And things which escape to me, that I cannot control, because it's true that I love, during the musical process, the composition process, not to control everything, in the sense that I have an idea of how it should sound, which is quite precise, but in the meantime, if at one point I discover a technique which creates a certain sound, I might integrate it only because I have the intuition that it might mix well. So sometimes you're sure and you're not sure. It's really, there is an uncertainty. So that's why I like to rewrite, let's say, all what the softwares are proposing to us.
Course.
That's the thing.
Of course.
But that's personal.
But I personally agree, because in fact I think that no tools can compose for you, in a sense. So that coming back to your statement in which you say that technology, the fun technology is there, but it doesn't help you if you don't have a deeper understanding of what you want to do. In this sense, I think that, for example, a tool like Orchide, this kind of family of orchestration or instrumentation, I would say, tools can be just something that will give you inspiration, in my opinion. So what I do usually when I use these tools also as a composer is that I get inspiration from these proposals, and then I of course work on that, because it's we would like to have the machine that please compose, but in fact we don't.
Yes. Yes, I think that that's a question of having a relationship of almost of power with the machine. It's how much you can escape the logic of the machine and what it's supposed to give to you, and how you escape, let's say, some very predictable, let's say, reactions or possible unpredictable reactions. But it's true that, it's almost philosophic kind of approach. But I think that some people, at least I was speaking about process in spectral music, sorry for just a parenthesis. It's true that some people have a very structural and very, let's say, rational relationship to a process. In order to create contrast, they will create a process, then contradict it with another process, let's say. And some people will change by hand a logic that they define with a process. So it's very personal, I think. And I don't think that the way you present this thing would prevent me of having the same logic, I think.
Okay, because for example, now we don't deal with time, but the idea is to go towards a time approach. So we want to orchestrate something that evolves in time. And this is the second question I wanted to ask you, okay? So when we speak about writing music, for example, so what I do, the question I wanted to ask you is about form. How do you deal with form? Because often, in my experience, when I had to deal with complex sounds, I was using an approach that is, let's say, bottom up. So I have sounds that I then organize in order to create a musical discourse. But usually, what I like best is a top-down approach. For example, I sketch out the form of something, and then I I don't know, I give details to each moment of the thing. So how do you do how do you deal with form in this sense? Because, for example, the piece that we listened itself is, it's a long form, that's 18 minutes. So, and of course, you had to face, because you didn't do sound design, but in fact you composed. You did face like questions about form. And can you tell me something, about
Well,
this?
yes, it's not very far necessarily from what you've done here, unless I'm mistaken. One thing which is quite important, it's true that I did not speak that much about it, is that I have a kind of, once again, back and forth with the plan, which means that I'm always, at the beginning, creating a kind of envelope, which is not far from that, in terms of where the, let's say, globally, the gestures are defined, let's say, the morphologies, let's say. And afterwards, I'm just hearing what I want, and I'm delivering things on paper. And of course, as you know, contradictions arise, which means that things happen that you did not expect, but in terms of phrasing, you want an opposition of registers, for instance, for your piece, you did not expect that. So I'm going back to the envelope, and I'm modifying it, and then I'm going back to the paper. So it's a kind of dialogue between the plan, which is always permanently modified,
feedback.
and yes, and I'm not too rigid about the plan, but it's interesting to go back to your initial plan and see how you dealt with some ideas that happen just only by putting the fountain pen on the paper. Okay? And I know you know a lot about that.
Yeah. Okay, so in the end, a tool like the Kids family that I showed this morning, because there are several versions. So there is a version that is historically the first one that has been used by Harvey for speakings, and then there are my versions like this one, for example. Okay, still we never addressed the compositional level. It's somehow a tool that addresses the pre-compositional level, in which I give you possible solution to a specific problem, and then you use this to put in, let's say, in your form, in your morphology. So I think it would be very interesting to discuss with you, for example, in order to understand what we could do to advance in this tool, like what we could do to add to this tool some more time behavior, temporal behavior, that it's something that's very difficult in a sense, no, right? Okay, yeah. The funny thing is that for example, when I do research, so when I compose, I usually do top down. Okay, so I mean, usually means, as you said, you have like a drawing, and then you go back and forth to this, and then you fill in, and then you start. But usually with research, I do bottom up often, because you need to understand blocks of the things, and the interaction could be very complex, and then you build up from the things. So it's of course, again, there you need to somehow see where you want to go, but I thought, because I try to do both research and composition, that it's a similar mindset, but in a sense it's opposite. Often it's opposite. So, and I'm not sure why, but it's difficult to develop a tool for composers, because when you do research, you face problems that need to be addressed bottom up, but at the same time you need to keep a top-down approach, because a composer often thinks in a bottom-up way, in a top-down way. Okay, so okay, the last thing. Sorry, do you want to?
Maybe one thing which might be of interest for everybody, I think, is the question of having a local, let's say, even the gesture is local in a way, but it's limited in time, or a sound, let's say, of any kind of sound, of percussion and so on, and you're proposing by the means of the computer something which is very interesting, a possible model to be distorted or articulated. So the articulation, I don't think that it's possible really to think, or otherwise it would be a kind of artificial intelligence which is able to recreate the process of composition. But so it seems to me difficult, and I'm not sure desirable.
Yeah.
But in terms of articulation, it's true. For instance, we have a very prosaic problem, a very specific problem, which is the evolution of the basses. Generally, the basses are giving a very dynamic movement to the music. And it's true that as long as you did not integrate any kind of sonic model into a logic which is horizontal, and for the basses and for any other thing, it's true that it's becoming difficult to articulate a model which has a very beautiful quality. It has been done, though, I think, of pieces like Gondwana by Murray, but it's true that it was very, in a very special, let's say, stretch
Context.
time.
Okay.
Yes, a temporal context. So it's true that when it comes to more articulated and fast music, it seems to me that the articulation becomes difficult because by the means of speed we might create timbre, but we might also fragment and go more to polyphony. So how do you articulate from here a polyphony which still makes sense?
That's a really
without losing the quality of the sound, if you want. So it's true that when I was saying that some complex sounds, I abandon them because I don't know how to articulate them and integrate them in the musical discourse, it's a little bit about those kind of things. I'm sure that some sounds that might come out of this approach might be satisfying and flexible in terms of articulation, and some others might be very rigid and might be abandoned. It depends on each composer. But I think after that, each composer must have the talent to blurry the frontier between what has been done with the computer and what has been done by hand. And I think that's really a challenge. But I think it's a part of the talent of someone who is able to use any software, let's say. Not only for orchestration, but also for pitches. I think it has been the case for open music and so on. How much you will, and when you will contradict the rule that has been expressed. I think the role of imagination is to, let's say, contradict the logic at the right moment. And you don't know exactly when, but then again, it's a lot of intuition. Well, I think any tool, and this one not less than the others, is interesting when you know that you will have to, let's say, create a dynamic movement with it and with your own language. And sometimes you will have to abandon things, and sometimes you will have to keep that, to be very close. I think it's possible to have also the other possibility that for a while you don't have that much things to change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it's up to it's too a personal question, I think.
So I agree, because for example you still need to have a critical approach on the tools, on the outcome of the tools, but in a sense, that's why time is so difficult for this kind of approach, because when you ask to a composer what you would do with time. So, for example, if you take this small excerpt, you see how. So there is a lot of detail. It's just not a note. It's just some kind of detailed figures that go over time. And well, we don't really know how to do this with a machine at the moment. I mean, there are, and also the question that you asked, is it interesting to have a machine that can do this? Because I'm not sure that we want this. But nonetheless, I think that we still could propose a machine that deals with time, and it gives you some kind of, waypoint that you can use to develop your like.
Well, one thing I don't want to show now the tool, but it's true that in the back library you have the possibility of, let's say, randomize a chord in time. Let's say for several seconds you will have this chord which is fragmented into several units, or maybe 30 of them, and the computer will propose an evolution in time which you can rework. But that's possible to, let's say, project in time and with pitches. So I suppose that maybe at one point it will be possible
Something
with
like
orchestration.
that. Yeah, something like that. That are not is not a temporal composition, but is more like waypoints that you can use to develop your own language. I think that we can give. I mean, what I would do is give some kind of beginning and ending of a process, and then you may want to develop the process yourself in a sense. That's the way you fill in, right?
And how much one can possibly implement some intuitive way of developing such an object in time is still a question for me. But then again, it's experimentation. That's why we don't have a conclusion. I think, for that.
Of course, yeah.
But definitely, I think I remember very well actually one conference that happened here. It was something like, I think it's 2003, and there was a kind of hard discussion between composers, knowing the tool has evolved. Yeah, but at the time I remember Jan Mares was in charge of the orchestration. Yes, and he was of course very in favor of developing orchestration. Let's say, orchestration tools with the machine, and some composers were very reluctant to it, as if it was a kind of sacred intuitive field that should not be approached. And that was very interesting, because when you have some kind of tension in order to preserve something, that's always interesting. I think that there was this kind of fear that the rationality would take over the intuition, I think, for some composers. And I think it's still, I'm not sure, Jean, I think maybe you felt this kind of thing, not only for the orchestra, Jean Lechard is. I think maybe you felt those kind of things, that at one point for some composers, not only me included, maybe there might be a moment where the fear of developing a tool is manifest.
So I think that the machine will never replace the composer first.
Well, yes, but that's a very contemporary question. Yeah. I mean, not maybe for us.
Perhaps you can have more fear with the virtual intelligence and machine learning and things like that. But
maybe we are the last composers.
Yes. Perhaps, but I mean, for the moment, I see any composer just pushing a button and just take the solution of the machine.
Unless you do it explicitly, like Daniele Ghisi decided to do this, like to ask the machine and use what the machine gave somehow. You know, be surprised by the machine, but then there are constraints or specific designs in which you want to use this kind of approach. But for example, I agree with Jan. I think that this fear. So I don't think that a machine can compose. Actually, I don't want a machine to compose. But I think that the fear of technology is always there. I mean, it was there for the orchestration. It's there now today for deep learning, approach that can generate like music or whatever. And the point is that if we keep a critical point of view on technology, and we understand that the necessity for me is not technical, is poetical. So we decide what is true by poetics, not by techniques. That's my own idea on that. And then if you keep safe these, you're safe in a sense, because it will never be the case in which the machine will tell you what is true. I mean, you decide what is true. And in my own world, I decide what is true with my music. And the machine, if it's correct, I mean, I use it. Otherwise, I don't. That's somehow a critical approach that can save you. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, okay. Well, I think I'm certainly not a specialist of this approach, but one could tell you that the critical approach could be integrated by the machine too.
Yeah. Okay.
So now that we came to this very morbid conclusion, I mean that's extremely interesting. I don't know. Maybe it's the time for us to finish, but I'm not sure, because I think it's a very interesting subject. So it's starting with another possible seminar.
Of course.
So anyway, I will think of that especially tonight, and I think you found the way of preventing me of sleeping. But thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.